John of God, The Crimes of a Spiritual Healer. Chapter 1. The Miracle Worker's Rise to Power. In the rolling hills of central Brazil, where the red earth meets endless skies, stands the small town of Abadiânia. For decades, this humble municipality in Goiás state was known for little more than its agricultural production and quiet rural life. But in the 1970s, everything changed when a man claiming to channel the spirits of deceased doctors began performing what he called miraculous healings. His name was João Teixeira de Faria, but the world would come to know him as João de Deus, John of God. By the time his empire crumbled in 2018, John of God had become one of Brazil's most internationally recognized figures, attracting millions of followers from around the globe. His Casa de Dom Inácio de Loyola became a pilgrimage site, where desperate souls sought healing for ailments that conventional medicine could not cure. Presidents, celebrities, and spiritual seekers made the journey to this remote corner of Brazil, believing they were witnessing divine intervention through the hands of a chosen vessel. The man who would become known as the world's most famous psychic surgeon was born into poverty in 1942 in the small town of Cachoeira da Fumaça. His childhood was marked by hardship, abuse, and early signs of the manipulative behavior that would later define his criminal enterprise. By age 16, he had already begun claiming supernatural abilities, telling anyone who would listen that he could communicate with the spirits of deceased medical professionals. John of God's rise to prominence was carefully orchestrated, built on a foundation of showmanship, psychological manipulation, and the desperate hope of those seeking miracles. His healing sessions, conducted in a converted warehouse that he called the Casa, became elaborate theatrical performances, where he would claim to channel various spirits while performing crude surgical procedures without anesthesia or proper medical equipment. The international attention began in the 1990s when foreign journalists and spiritual seekers started documenting his work. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and testimonials from supposed beneficiaries of his healing spread across the internet. Oprah Winfrey featured him on her show, lending her massive platform to legitimize his claims and attracting even more international visitors to Abadiânia. But behind the facade of spiritual healing and divine intervention lay a darker truth that would eventually surface in one of Brazil's most shocking criminal cases. The man who claimed to heal bodies was systematically destroying souls, using his position of power and trust to commit crimes that would horrify the world and shatter the faith of millions who had believed in his divine mission. Chapter 2. The Making of a False Prophet. João Teixeira de Faria's journey from impoverished child to internationally acclaimed spiritual healer was paved with manipulation, exploitation, and a carefully cultivated image of divine connection. Born into a family of 16 children in rural Goiás, his early life was characterized by extreme poverty, domestic violence, and the kind of desperation that often breeds either saints or monsters. In João's case, it would be the latter. His father, João Teixeira de Faria, was a violent alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and children, creating an atmosphere of fear and instability that would profoundly shape João's understanding of power dynamics. His mother, Francisca, was a devoutly religious woman who sought solace in spiritualism and folk healing practices, inadvertently providing her son with the foundation for his future deceptions. At age 9, João claimed to have experienced his first spiritual encounter when he allegedly saw a beautiful woman who identified herself as Saint Rita of Cassia. This supposed vision, which he would later embellish and expand upon, became the cornerstone of his spiritual narrative and the beginning of his lifelong pattern of using religious imagery to manipulate others. The young João displayed early signs of the narcissistic and antisocial traits that would later enable his crimes. He was charming when it served his purposes, but cruel and manipulative when crossed. Teachers and neighbors described him as a child who seemed to enjoy having power over others, often organizing elaborate games where he would play the role of leader or healer, while other children served as his followers or patients. His formal education ended early, but João was a keen observer of human nature and quickly learned to exploit people's vulnerabilities. He studied the local healing traditions, observed the techniques of legitimate folk healers, and began developing the theatrical skills that would later make his performances so convincing to desperate believers seeking miracles. By his teenage years, João had begun traveling throughout rural Brazil, claiming to channel various spirits and offering healing services to anyone willing to pay. His early performances were crude and often unsuccessful, but he learned from each failure, refining his techniques and developing the psychological manipulation skills that would later enable him to control thousands of followers. The transformation from small-time con artist to internationally recognized spiritual leader required decades of careful image building and strategic networking. João understood that legitimacy in the spiritual healing world required endorsements from respected figures, testimonials from satisfied customers, and most importantly, the appearance of genuine supernatural abilities. He began cultivating relationships with influential people in Brazilian society, including politicians, celebrities, and wealthy business people who were drawn to his claims of spiritual power. These early supporters provided him with the resources and credibility needed to establish his permanent base of operations in Abadiânia and begin attracting international attention. The Casa de Dom Inácio de Loyola, which opened in the 1970s, became the physical manifestation of João's spiritual empire. The facility was designed to create an atmosphere of reverence and mystery, with dimly lit rooms, religious imagery, and carefully orchestrated rituals that reinforced the belief that something supernatural was occurring within its walls. Chapter 3. The Theatre of False Miracles. The Casa de Dom Inácio de Loyola operated like a well-orchestrated theatre production, with João de Deus as the star performer and his staff as supporting actors in an elaborate deception that convinced millions of people they were witnessing genuine miracles. The facility, which could accommodate hundreds of visitors at a time, was designed to create an atmosphere of spiritual reverence that made questioning the proceedings seem almost sacrilegious. Visitors to the casa would typically arrive after long journeys, often from other countries, carrying with them desperate hope for healing from conditions that conventional medicine had failed to cure. They came seeking miracles for cancer, paralysis, blindness, and countless other ailments, willing to believe in anything that offered the possibility of relief from their suffering. The healing sessions followed a carefully scripted routine that maximized psychological impact while minimizing the risk of exposure. João would enter the main hall wearing simple white clothing, claiming to be channeling the spirit of a deceased doctor or surgeon. His demeanor would change dramatically during these supposed possessions, with his voice becoming deeper and his movements more authoritative. The most dramatic aspect of his performances involved what he called spiritual surgery, crude procedures performed without anesthesia, proper sterilization, or medical training. Using simple instruments like kitchen knives and scissors, he would make incisions, insert forceps into patients' noses, or scrape eyes with knives, all while claiming that the spirits were guiding his hands and preventing pain or infection. These procedures were designed to shock and awe observers while creating the illusion of supernatural intervention. The lack of apparent pain in patients was often attributed to spiritual anesthesia, but medical experts later explained that the techniques João used typically involved areas of the body with few nerve endings or relied on patients' psychological state to minimize pain perception. The psychological manipulation extended far beyond the healing sessions themselves. Visitors were required to follow strict protocols that reinforced their belief in João's power, while making it difficult for them to think critically about what they were witnessing. They were told to wear white clothing, maintain silence during certain periods, and avoid questioning the procedures or outcomes. João's staff played crucial roles in maintaining the illusion of legitimacy. They would carefully screen visitors, identifying those most likely to respond positively to the treatments while weeding out potential skeptics or troublemakers. They also collected detailed information about visitors' conditions and backgrounds, which João would later use to create the impression of supernatural knowledge. The facility generated enormous revenue through donations, sales of blessed items and fees for various services. Visitors were encouraged to purchase crystals, herbs, and other items that were supposedly blessed by the spirits and possessed healing properties. The economic engine that powered the casa was built on the desperation and hope of people seeking miracles. If you're finding this investigation into spiritual fraud as compelling as we are, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There are many more layers to this. Deception that will shock you, the international media attention that João received only served to legitimize his operations in the eyes of believers. Television documentaries, magazine articles, and books written by convinced visitors created a feedback loop that brought even more people to Abadiânia seeking healing. The more famous he became, the more credible his claims appeared to those desperate for hope. Chapter 4. The Web of Abuse begins to unravel. For decades, João de Deus operated his spiritual empire with apparent impunity, protected by a combination of devoted followers, political connections, and the reluctance of victims to come forward against a figure revered by millions. However, beneath the surface of his healing ministry, a pattern of sexual abuse was occurring that would eventually lead to his downfall and expose the true nature of the man behind the miracle worker facade. The abuse typically began during private healing sessions, where João would claim that certain patients required special spiritual treatments that could only be performed away from the main healing rooms. These private sessions, conducted in secluded areas of the casa or in his personal residence, created opportunities for him to exploit vulnerable women who trusted him completely due to his supposed divine connection. João's victims were often women who had traveled great distances seeking healing for serious medical conditions, making them particularly vulnerable to manipulation. They were told that their healing required special spiritual procedures that involved intimate contact, and that questioning these methods would interfere with the spiritual process and prevent their recovery. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and cruel. João would use his supposed spiritual authority to convince victims that sexual contact was necessary for their healing, that they had been chosen for special spiritual purposes, or that resistance to his advances would result in spiritual consequences. Many victims were so desperate for healing that they submitted to abuse rather than risk losing what they believed was their only chance for recovery. The abuse was not limited to adult women. Over time, it became clear that João had also targeted teenage girls and young women, often using his position as a spiritual authority figure to gain access to victims through their families. Parents who brought their daughters to the casa seeking healing never imagined that they were delivering them into the hands of a predator. The first cracks in João's facade began to appear in the early 2010s when former followers started questioning some of his practices and sharing their concerns with journalists and investigators. However, these early allegations were often dismissed or suppressed due to João's powerful connections and the reluctance of the Brazilian media to challenge such a prominent figure. The breakthrough came in December 2018 when Brazilian television program Conversa com Bial aired a special investigation featuring multiple women who came forward with detailed accounts of sexual abuse at the hands of João de Deus. The program, hosted by Pedro Bial, provided a platform for victims to tell their stories and expose the systematic nature of the abuse that had been occurring for decades. The television exposé was devastating in its impact, featuring emotional testimonies from women who described how their trust in a supposed holy man had been betrayed in the most intimate and damaging way possible. The victims came from various countries and backgrounds, but their stories shared common elements that painted a clear picture of predatory behavior disguised as spiritual healing. The international reaction was swift and severe. Media outlets around the world picked up the story, and the man who had once been celebrated as a miracle worker was suddenly exposed as an alleged serial sexual predator. The contrast between his public image and the accusations against him was so stark that it sent shockwaves through the spiritual healing community and beyond. Chapter 5. The victims find their voice. The courage of the women who came forward to expose João de Deus cannot be overstated. Breaking their silence meant facing not only the trauma of reliving their abuse, but also the potential backlash from millions of devoted followers who refused to believe that their spiritual leader could be capable of such crimes. These brave women risked their reputations, their safety, and their peace of mind to ensure that justice would finally be served. Zahira Lieneke Moos, a Dutch choreographer, was one of the first to publicly accuse João de sexual abuse. Her detailed account of being assaulted during what was supposed to be a spiritual healing session provided a template that encouraged other victims to come forward with their own stories. Moose described how João had used his supposed spiritual authority to manipulate her into a private session where the abuse occurred. The accounts that emerged painted a disturbing picture of systematic predatory behavior that had been occurring for decades. Victims described being told that sexual contact was necessary for their spiritual healing, that they had been chosen for special spiritual purposes, or that resistance would interfere with their recovery. The manipulation was sophisticated, preying on the vulnerability and desperation of people seeking miracles. Sabrina Bittencourt, a Brazilian activist and writer, played a crucial role in encouraging victims to come forward and providing them with support during the difficult process of going public with their accusations. Bittencourt had been investigating João for years and had collected testimonies from numerous victims. Building a comprehensive case against the supposed healer, the victims came from around the world, representing the international scope of João's operations and the global reach of his deception. Women from the United States, Europe, Australia, and throughout Latin America shared remarkably similar stories of abuse, indicating that the predatory behavior was not isolated incidents, but rather a systematic pattern of exploitation. Many victims described feeling confused and traumatized after their abuse, struggling to reconcile what had happened to them with their belief in João's spiritual authority. Some had convinced themselves that the abuse was somehow part of their spiritual journey, while others had suppressed the memories entirely until other victims began speaking out. The psychological impact on victims was severe and long-lasting. Many reported developing anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of their abuse. The betrayal of trust was particularly damaging because it involved not just sexual assault, but also the destruction of their spiritual beliefs and faith in divine healing. The process of coming forward was made more difficult by the reaction of João's devoted followers, many of whom refused to believe the accusations and attacked the victim's credibility. Social media became a battleground where supporters of João attempted to discredit the women who had accused him, adding another layer of trauma to their already difficult situation. Legal experts noted that sexual abuse cases involving religious or spiritual leaders are particularly challenging to prosecute because of the power dynamics involved and the reluctance of victims to come forward. The fact that so many women were willing to speak out against João, despite these challenges, demonstrated the severity of his crimes. and the strength of their determination to see justice served. Share this story to help ensure that other victims of spiritual abuse find the courage to speak out. Silence only protects the predators. The international media attention that followed the initial accusations created a snowball effect that encouraged even more victims to come forward. As each new story emerged, it became increasingly clear that João's crimes were far more extensive than initially imagined, involving hundreds of potential victims over several decades. Chapter 6. The Investigation and Manhunt. The Brazilian authorities' response to the allegations against João de Deus was swift and comprehensive, reflecting both the seriousness of the accusations and the high-profile nature of the case. The Goiás State Civil Police, led by Delegate Igor Limongi, launched a massive investigation that would eventually uncover evidence of crimes spanning several decades and involving hundreds of potential victims. The investigation, dubbed Operation Transparency, began with the testimonies provided by the victims who had come forward on television and in subsequent interviews. Detectives worked methodically to corroborate these accounts, gathering physical evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a comprehensive case against the man who had hidden his crimes behind a facade of spiritual healing. One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation was the international scope of João's operations and the fact that many potential victims lived in other countries. Brazilian authorities worked with international law enforcement agencies to gather testimonies from victims around the world and to ensure that the full extent of his crimes would be documented. The investigation revealed that João's criminal enterprise was far more sophisticated than initially apparent. He had used his network of followers and employees to identify potential victims, gather information about their vulnerabilities, and create opportunities for abuse. The Casa de Dominacio de Loyola was not just a spiritual center, but also a carefully designed hunting ground for a sexual predator. Financial investigations revealed that João had amassed enormous wealth through his spiritual healing operations, with assets including multiple properties, luxury vehicles, and substantial bank accounts. The money trail provided additional evidence of the systematic nature of his operations and the extent to which he had profited from the desperation of people seeking healing. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that João had been aware of the mounting allegations against him and was preparing to flee the country. Intelligence reports indicated that he was making arrangements to travel to countries without extradition treaties with Brazil, prompting authorities to accelerate their timeline for making arrests. On December 16, 2018, just days after the television expose aired, a judge issued an arrest warrant for João de Deus on charges of rape and sexual abuse. The warrant marked the beginning of a manhunt that would capture international attention and demonstrate that even the most powerful and revered figures could not escape justice. When their crimes were exposed, João initially attempted to evade arrest by moving between various properties and safe houses, relying on his network of devoted followers to provide shelter and assistance. However, the intense media attention and police pressure made it increasingly difficult for him to remain hidden, and his options for escape were rapidly diminishing. The manhunt intensified when authorities discovered that João was planning to flee to Paraguay, where he had connections and assets that could help him avoid extradition. Police surveillance teams tracked his movements and intercepted communications that revealed his escape plans, allowing them to stay one step ahead of the fugitive. The dramatic conclusion to the manhunt came on December 16, 2018, when João finally surrendered to police at a rural property in Abadiânia. His surrender was broadcast live on television, showing the once powerful spiritual leader being taken into custody in handcuffs, a stark contrast to the reverent treatment he had received from followers for decades. The arrest of João de Deus sent shockwaves through Brazil and around the world, marking the end of one of the most extensive spiritual fraud and sexual abuse cases in modern history. The man who had claimed to channel divine spirits was finally facing earthly justice for his very human crimes. Chapter 7. The Trial and Testimonies. The trial of João de Deus began in earnest in 2019, conducted in the courthouse of Anápolis, Goiás, under intense media scrutiny and public interest. Judge Rosângela Rodrigues presided over proceedings that would ultimately determine whether the man revered by millions as a divine, HEALER, would be held accountable for decades of alleged sexual abuse and fraud. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Gabriela de Freitas Manzan, faced the challenging task of proving systematic sexual abuse in cases where much of the evidence was testimonial, and some incidents had occurred years or even decades earlier. However, the sheer number of victims who came forward and the consistency of their accounts created a compelling case that painted a clear picture of predatory behavior. The testimonies of victims were the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, with women from around the world providing detailed accounts of their abuse at the hands of João. These testimonies were often emotional and difficult to hear, as victims described how their trust in a supposed holy man had been betrayed in the most intimate and damaging way possible. One of the most powerful testimonies came from a Brazilian woman who described being sexually abused by João when she was just 14 years old. Her account of how he had used his spiritual authority to manipulate and abuse her provided crucial evidence of his predatory behavior toward minors and demonstrated the long-term psychological damage caused by his crimes. International victims also provided testimony via video link, describing their experiences and the impact that the abuse had on their lives. These testimonies helped establish the global scope of João's crimes and demonstrated that his predatory behavior was not limited to Brazilian victims, but extended to vulnerable people from around the world. The defense team, led by attorney Alberto Toron, faced an almost impossible task in defending a client whose crimes had been extensively documented and whose victims numbered in the hundreds. Their strategy focused on challenging the credibility of individual testimonies and arguing that the accusations were part of a conspiracy to destroy João's reputation and spiritual mission. The defense attempted to portray João as a legitimate spiritual healer who had been falsely accused by women seeking financial gain or attention. They argued that the supposed victims had misinterpreted legitimate spiritual healing procedures and that the accusations were the result of cultural misunderstandings or psychological manipulation by anti-spiritual forces. This defense strategy was largely unsuccessful, as the consistency and detail of the victim testimonies made it clear that the abuse was real and systematic. The defense's attempts to discredit the victims only served to highlight the courage it had taken for these women to come forward against such a powerful and revered figure. Expert witnesses played a crucial role in the trial, with psychologists and psychiatrists explaining the dynamics of spiritual abuse and the psychological techniques that predators use to manipulate their victims. These experts helped the court understand how João had used his supposed spiritual authority to create an environment where abuse could occur without resistance or reporting. Medical experts also testified about the fraudulent nature of João's supposed healing abilities, explaining that his crude surgical procedures had no medical basis and could actually be dangerous to patients. This testimony helped establish that João's entire spiritual healing operation was based on deception and exploitation rather than genuine supernatural abilities. The trial was complicated by the intense public interest and the divided opinions about João's guilt or innocence. While many Brazilians were horrified by the allegations and demanded justice, others remained convinced of his spiritual abilities and refused to believe that he could be capable of such crimes. Like and subscribe if you want to. Follow more cases that expose how predators use positions of trust and authority to exploit their victims. Awareness is our best defense against such crimes. Chapter 8. The Verdict and Consequences. On December 19, 2019, Judge Rosangela Rodriguez delivered the verdict that millions of people around the world had been waiting for. João Teixeira was found guilty of rape and sexual abuse and sentenced to 19 years and 4 months in prison for crimes committed against 4 victims. The sentence represented just the beginning of his legal troubles, as he faced additional charges related to hundreds of other alleged victims. The conviction was met with relief and satisfaction by victim advocates and supporters of justice, who saw it as validation of the courage shown by the women who had come forward to expose João's crimes. However, many felt that the sentence was insufficient given the scope and severity of his crimes, which had affected hundreds of victims over several decades. The trial and conviction had far-reaching consequences beyond João's personal fate. The case exposed serious flaws in Brazil's regulation of spiritual healing practices and highlighted the need for better protection of vulnerable people who seek alternative medical treatments. The lack of oversight that had allowed João to operate with impunity for decades became a subject of national debate. The international impact was equally significant, as the case prompted spiritual communities around the world to examine their own practices and safeguards against abuse. Many organizations implemented new policies and procedures designed to prevent predators from using spiritual authority to exploit vulnerable followers. The financial empire that João had built through his spiritual healing operations also came under scrutiny, with authorities working to trace assets and determine how much money he had extracted from desperate people seeking healing. The investigation revealed a complex network of properties, bank accounts, and business interests that had generated enormous wealth for the supposed healer. Victims and their advocates began pursuing civil lawsuits, seeking compensation for the damage caused by João's crimes. These legal actions faced significant challenges, as many victims lived in other countries and the statute of limitations had expired for some of the older cases. However, the civil litigation served an important purpose in providing additional forums for victims to seek justice. The Casa de Dom Inácio de Loyola, which had been the center of João's operations for decades, was forced to close its doors following his arrest and conviction. The facility that had once attracted thousands of visitors seeking healing became a symbol of the deception and abuse that had occurred there, and local authorities struggled with what to do with the property. The impact on Abadiânia, the small town that had built its economy around João's spiritual healing operations, was devastating. Local businesses that had catered to the thousands of visitors who came seeking healing were forced to close or find new sources of income. The town's reputation was forever tainted by its association with one of Brazil's most notorious criminals. João's conviction also had a significant impact on the broader spiritual healing community. In Brazil and around the world, many legitimate practitioners found themselves under increased scrutiny and had to work harder to distinguish themselves from fraudulent operators like João. The case served as a wake-up call for the entire industry about the need for better self-regulation and accountability. The psychological impact on João's former followers was profound and long-lasting. Many people who had believed in his spiritual abilities and had even claimed to have been healed by him struggled to reconcile their experiences with the reality of his crimes. Some experienced a crisis of faith that extended beyond their belief in João to their spiritual beliefs in general. Chapter 9. The Psychology of a Spiritual Predator. Understanding how João Teixeira was able to deceive millions of people and commit hundreds of crimes over several decades requires an examination of the psychological techniques he used and the vulnerabilities he exploited in his victims. Forensic psychologists who studied his case identified a complex pattern of manipulation that combined elements of religious authority, psychological coercion, and sexual predation. João's success as a spiritual fraud was built on his ability to exploit the desperation of people facing serious medical conditions that conventional medicine could not cure. He understood that desperate people are willing to believe in almost anything that offers hope, and he crafted his persona and operations specifically to appeal to this vulnerability. The use of religious and spiritual authority was central to João's manipulation techniques. By claiming to channel the spirits of deceased doctors and saints, he positioned himself as a conduit for divine power that was beyond human questioning or criticism. This supposed spiritual authority made it extremely difficult for victims to resist his advances or report his crimes. The theatrical nature of his healing sessions served multiple psychological purposes. The dramatic surgical procedures, the claims of spiritual possession, and the atmosphere of reverence and mystery all worked together to create a state of heightened suggestibility in his followers. People who witnessed these performances often entered an altered psychological state that made them more susceptible to manipulation. João's selection of victims was not random but followed a calculated pattern that maximized his chances of success while minimizing the risk of exposure. He typically targeted women who were desperate for healing, isolated from their support systems, and unlikely to be believed if they reported abuse. Many of his victims were foreigners who would return to their home countries after the abuse, making it difficult for them to pursue justice. The grooming process that João used with his victims was sophisticated and gradual. He would begin by establishing himself as a spiritual authority figure, worthy of complete trust and obedience. He would then gradually introduce increasingly intimate contact under the guise of spiritual healing, slowly breaking down normal boundaries and resistance. The psychological impact of spiritual abuse is often more severe than other forms of sexual assault because it involves not just physical violation but also the destruction of the victim's spiritual beliefs and sense of divine protection. Many of João's victims reported feeling not just sexually traumatized, but also spiritually devastated by the realization that their faith had been exploited. João's ability to maintain his deception for so long was also aided by the psychological phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance. When people have invested heavily in a belief system, they are reluctant to accept evidence that contradicts their beliefs. Many of João's followers experienced cognitive dissonance when confronted with evidence of his crimes and chose to deny or rationalize the evidence rather than accept that they had been deceived. The international nature of João's operations also provided psychological protection from exposure. Victims who returned to their home countries often felt isolated and unsure about how to report crimes that had occurred in a foreign country under such unusual circumstances. The cultural and linguistic barriers made it even more difficult for victims to seek justice. Subscribe to our channel to learn more about how predators use psychological manipulation to exploit their victims. Understanding these techniques is crucial for protecting ourselves and others. Mental health experts who studied João's case noted that his crimes represented a particularly insidious form of abuse because they occurred in a context where victims were seeking healing and spiritual growth. The betrayal of trust was complete, involving not just sexual assault, but also the exploitation of the victim's deepest hopes and spiritual beliefs. Chapter 10. The Shattered. Faith and Lasting Legacy. The fall of João de Deus sent shockwaves through the global spiritual healing community that continued to reverberate years after his conviction. The man who had been revered as a divine healer by millions of followers around the world was exposed as a sexual predator who had used his supposed spiritual gifts to exploit and abuse vulnerable people seeking hope and healing. The impact on his former followers was devastating and complex. Many people who had traveled thousands of miles to seek healing at the Casa de Dominacio de Loyola found themselves grappling with the reality that their spiritual experiences had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. Some had claimed to have been healed by João's interventions, and they struggled to understand how genuine healing could have occurred through the hands of such an evil man. The psychological trauma extended far beyond João's direct victims to include the thousands of people who had believed in his mission and had organized their spiritual lives around his teachings. Support groups formed around the world to help former followers process their experiences and rebuild their faith after such a profound betrayal of trust. The case prompted a broader examination of the spiritual healing industry and the lack of regulation that allows fraudulent practitioners to operate with impunity. Many countries began implementing stricter oversight of alternative healing practices and requiring better credentials and accountability from those claiming supernatural abilities. Sabrina Bittencourt, the activist who had played a crucial role in exposing João's crimes, tragically died in February 2019, just months after his arrest. Her death was ruled a suicide, and many believed that the stress of fighting against such a powerful figure and the threats she had received had contributed to her decision to end her life. Her sacrifice became a symbol of the courage required to expose powerful predators. The victims of João's crimes continue to struggle with the long-term consequences of their abuse. Many have required extensive therapy to deal with the trauma of sexual assault, combined with the destruction of their spiritual beliefs. Some have become advocates for other victims of spiritual abuse, working to prevent similar crimes from occurring in the future. The legal proceedings against João continued long after his initial conviction, with additional charges being filed as more victims came forward. Prosecutors estimated that he may have abused as many as 600 women over the course of his career, making him one of the most prolific sexual predators in modern history. The financial investigation into João's empire revealed the enormous wealth he had accumulated through his fraudulent healing operations. Authorities worked to trace assets and return money to victims, but the complex international nature of his operations made this process extremely difficult and time-consuming. The town of Abadiânia, which had built its economy around João's operations, faced an uncertain future after his downfall. Local officials worked to develop new sources of tourism and economic activity, but the town's association with one of Brazil's most notorious criminals made this transition extremely challenging. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of people facing serious medical conditions and the need for better support systems. For those seeking alternative treatments, medical professionals and patient advocates used João's case to educate the public about the dangers of unregulated healing practices and the importance of maintaining realistic expectations about alternative medicine. The international media coverage of João's crimes helped raise awareness about spiritual abuse and the techniques that predators use to exploit religious authority. Educational programs were developed to help people recognize the warning signs of spiritual manipulation and to encourage reporting of suspected abuse. The legacy of João de Deus serves as a permanent reminder that evil can hide behind the most sacred facades and that vigilance is required to protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit their faith and desperation. His crimes demonstrated that no one, regardless of their claimed spiritual authority or international reputation, should be above scrutiny or accountability. The courage of the women who came forward to expose João's crimes continues to inspire other victims of spiritual abuse to speak out against their abusers. Their bravery in the face of enormous pressure and potential backlash helped ensure that justice was served and that other potential victims were protected from similar abuse. As the spiritual healing community continues to grapple with the lessons of João's case. His story serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. The need for better regulation, accountability, and protection of vulnerable people has never been clearer, and the memory of his victims demands that meaningful changes be implemented to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The man who once claimed to channel divine spirits to heal the sick, I will spend the remainder of his life in prison. A fitting end for someone who used the sacred trust placed in him to commit unspeakable crimes against those who sought nothing more than hope and healing in their darkest hours. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to discover other real crimes that shocked the world and the minds behind them.